Hey guys, it's Jonah from Dropgun Samples here with a new tutorial for you. Today, I'm going to be showing you guys how to make a track in the style of SIDEPIECE. And at the end, it should sound something like this. So, as many of you know, SIDEPIECE is the tech house super duo composed of Nitty and Party Favor. They've had many chart-topping singles since their debut in 2019, and we love all the stuff they're putting out. For this video, I have a build-up and a drop in the style of SIDEPIECE, and I'm going to break down the individual parts that make the song. Most of the sounds that I'm using in this project are included in our new pack titled Bass Tech House that's available on our website. It has everything you need to put together your next bass-driven tech house hit. If you're interested, I'll leave a link for the pack in the description below. And now, without any more delay, let's jump right into the project. Before I start breaking this project down, let's give this track one more listen. So as you can hear, it's a very bouncy bass and tech house driven style with synths and vocals that really complement the groove of the bass line. And with that said, the first element of this track that I want to break down is the bass line. The bass line is made up of two different layers, one being essentially an FM pluck and the other being more of a sub bass to really come together and make a dark, groovy sound. So let's strip these layers back and first take a look at this FM pluck. This was a sound I created in Serum. Let's start with the basic shapes wavetable and set it to a square wave. Take the oscillator down 2 octaves and make sure your random phase is set to 0. Next, let's move into oscillator B. Select the harmonic morph wavetable under the digital section. Be sure to bring this oscillator down 2 octaves as well. Set your wavetable position to about 77 and your random phase to 0. Lastly, make sure the level of oscillator B is turned all the way down. We're only going to be using oscillator B as a frequency modulation oscillator. It's not going to be actually present in the sound. Let's move into our filter now. Switch it to an MG low 18. Make sure that oscillator A is routed through the filter. Set your cutoff to about 57 Hz. Push your resonance all the way up to 55% and make sure you add some drive to get some nice saturation. Let's jump back to oscillator A really quick. Go ahead into your warping menu and select FM from B. This is going to make it so that the frequency of oscillator B is actually going to modulate oscillator A. Set the parameter to about 25%. Now, let's move over to envelope 1 and make sure your ADSR looks somewhat similar to this with a decay of about 700 milliseconds. Let's take envelope 1 and then route it to the warping of oscillator A, as well as the cutoff of the filter. If you jump on over to the matrix, you can see that the parameters for this are 15 on the warping and 24 on the filter. Before we move on to effects, go over to your voicing and make sure your triggering is in monophonic so that your bass notes don't overlap at all. Moving into the effects, we have a hard clip distortion, and the important thing about this is that I have the post distortion filter added to it. This low pass filter has a frequency of 125 Hz. Make sure to set your drive up for the hard clipper to about 27%. Next, let's take envelope 1 and drop it right onto the frequency of the filter in the distortion. For this parameter, I have it set to about 28. This is going to add some extra character to the bass and make sure that that hard clip isn't coming through too hard. Next, we move on to a compressor to shave off the tops, an EQ to maintain some of those leftover high frequencies, and then we move into another filter. Set this one to MG low 18 as well. You're going to want your cutoff around 60 Hz. Now jump into envelope 2 and draw a similar envelope to envelope 1, only this time we're going to have a slightly longer decay. We want to take envelope 2 and route this to the cutoff, and what this is going to do is just do that last little bit of maintenance, but I don't want this to be as short and tight as the previous envelopes. I do want this to leave a little bit on the top. Moving into the matrix, that parameter is just about 35. We're going to jump our resonance up to 33% and make sure you add a little bit of drive as well. Next, we have a chorus to add some wideness and a very small room reverb with most of the lows cut off to add a little bit of depth. Now let's move on to post-processing. For processing, I started with a multi-band transient shaper just to really heighten the attack on some of the mids and the highs. Next, I have iZotope Neutron 3's multi-band saturator, and this one is really important for getting the high and mid frequencies to shine. And finally, I finish it off with an EQ that's going to shave off any of those sub-frequencies that are going to clash with the lower layer. Now, let's move on to our sublayer. The sublayer is a serum patch from our Bass Tech House pack titled Globe Sub. Starting with oscillator A, we're utilizing analog bass drum sine, and we have it turned down an octave. Moving on to oscillator B, we're using Matrixy C64 from the analog section. Turn that down 2 octaves. Move your wavetable position and your level for this oscillator to about halfway. Moving into the filter tab, we selected MG low 12. Since this is a sub bass, make sure your cutoff is all the way down at 8 Hz because we're going to be moving it with an envelope anyway. Make sure oscillators A and B are both routing through the filter. We're going to turn our resonance up to match the resonant movement of the top bass. Also, make sure your drive is a bit turned up so we can get that bit of saturation. Moving into envelope 1, it's a very similar envelope to the top bass layer. The decay is slightly longer and the sustain is all the way down. Make sure you add a decent amount of release to this one because we want to fill in those empty spaces in between the bass plucks. And as always, move over to your voicing tab and make sure that you're playing monophonic notes. Now we're going to take envelope 1 and route that to the cutoff of the filter. For this parameter, you want that moving straight upwards about 59. Now let's move into the effects tab. The only thing applied to this bass is a tube distortion. You can go ahead and turn on that post distortion filter again and make sure your frequency is around 447 Hz. Turn up your drive to about a third of the way, and then let's move into LFO1. We're going to be treating LFO1 as an envelope, so make sure you have the envelope trigger on right here. Move the rate to a bar and make a quick downward ramp just like this. Route envelope 1 to the drive and only go up about 16. This is going to create that little bit of extra punch in the sub bass that's going to take the overall sound to the next level. And for post-processing on this sub bass, I first just have a single band compressor that's only pulling the peaks off the bass, and then I have an EQ that's shaving off the bottom 20 Hz as well as the top frequencies that might clash with the top layer bass. One more time, let's hear those layers together. One thing to point out is that every 8 bars on that transition point, I pull the sub bass out and just leave that top bass. Doing this ensures that I leave optimal space for any fill that I want in that section, and then the next section has that much more impact. So during this drop, I actually copied the MIDI from the bass line up to a synth layer, and then what I did is isolate the notes from this MIDI that I felt like stood out the most to me. And with that synth layer, those sound like this. This sound from our Bass Tech House pack is a serum lead titled Amsterdam. For this sound, you want to utilize a sine wave and a saw wave. For both oscillators, turn the octave down 1 and set the unison to about 7 or 8. Make sure your detunes for both oscillators are all the way down and your random phasing is all the way up. For your sine wave, jump into your warping menu and turn on sync. A little bit of this will actually add a bit of extra texture to the top of your sine wave. Turn on the noise oscillator and select bright white, and then go over to your filter, make sure all oscillators are routing through it. Turn on MG low 18 and the cutoff should be all the way down. Add about 5% resonance and turn up your drive and fatness levels just a little bit for some extra saturation. Moving on to envelope 1, we want to create a pretty quick pluck envelope, but you want to add some extra attack so that we can get that whipping effect. Let's take envelope 1 and route that to the cutoff of the filter. And as you can see, the parameter for that is about 75. Moving into effects, we have the tube distortion on and the pre-distortion filter is on with about 3000 Hz cutoff. Make sure your resonance is at a Q of about 1.8. You also want to make sure you turn up your drive pretty significantly. We also have a multi-band compressor to thicken and smooth the sound. and then an EQ to cut off some of those low frequencies. And for post-processing, we're looking at another multi-band saturator. This is really just adding some tape and retro saturation to the high bands, as well as some very small room reverb with a wet at only about 9%. And then finally an EQ to shave off any of those unwanted lower frequencies that might end up clashing with the bassline. Now, moving on to the next synth, we have a very simple filtered saw lead. This is a lead also from our bass tech house pack titled Dance Saw. This one is made up of 2 different saw waves. One of them is turned down 3 octaves and the other 1 octave. Each oscillator has 4 voices of unison and their detunes are at about 50%. Moving into our filter, we have the MG Low 6, and oscillator B is routed through the MG Low 6. Since oscillator A is already turned down 3 octaves, there's not going to be too much high frequencies to be cutting off anyway, so we're going to let those natural frequencies actually come through. Our cutoff is at about 200 Hz and the resonance is over 30%. Make sure you also turn up the drive for that bit of distortion. Moving into the effects tab, we have some tube distortion, and for this one you want to turn the drive up to about 75% and take the mix down a little bit. And finally, to finish it off, we have a medium-sized hall reverb. You might want to cut some of those low frequencies off as well. Now let's do some post-processing on this lead. The first thing I added was this multi-band saturator, and it's really just heightening up the high frequencies. Next, we have an EQ, and since this sound is so low in octave, we want to make sure we cut off any of those frequencies that are going to clash with our bass line. Lastly, for the synths, I have this little atmospheric pad that comes in as a transitional piece during the drop. So that's it for the leads and the basses. Let's talk about the next piece of the project, which is the drums. As always, it's most important of all of the elements in your drums to have a really solid kick. With these kinds of tech house tracks, I really like to make sure that I have a kick with more mid presence, and I don't like it to have too much high presence. And what I mean by that is I don't like kicks with too much click or too much snap. Here's a kick from our sample pack that I put through my sampler and tuned down to the key of the song. As you can see and as you can hear, there aren't many high frequencies going on with the kick. In fact, I tried to pump a little bit of my own in there. Otherwise, this kick is mainly reserved for these mid, low mid, punchy frequencies. All I really did to mix it here was cut off those bottom 20 to 30 Hertz and make sure that there wasn't any muddy frequencies coming through the kick. Moving on to our clap. Same thing with these tech house tracks is I like to get a nice, quick, transient clap. Grabbed a clap from our sample pack and I used a fade to get it nice and quick. In order to double down on that tightness, I added a transient shaper and an EQ to cut off some of those low frequencies. Now, moving on from the clap, let's look at some hats. As you can see here, I have a basic hi-hat structure. I made sure to choose very short and transient hi-hat samples. However, as you can see, on every first offbeat of every 4 bars, I have an extra open hi-hat layer just to add a little bit of flair. It really helps to add a little bit of tape saturation to the mid and high bands of your hi-hats to make sure that they're crunching and they're not hissing too much. And then always make sure you're cutting off those low muddy frequencies. In addition to the hats, we have a little bit of a ride cymbal here being introduced halfway through the drop. Sitting on the offbeats and complementing the hi-hats, this thing is really injecting some extra energy into the second half of this drop. You could also choose to add little flares to your beat like this little clap fill that interrupts the beat after the first 4 bars. And the last piece of percussion is a quick crash cymbal that's introducing the beginning of the drop. Now, before we move on, let's listen to all of those drums together. Now that we've gotten through the drums, let's move through the effects. I think with this type of tech house, it's definitely important to try to sprinkle a couple effects here and there throughout your drop to keep it interesting. And here I grabbed a couple samples from our pack and I placed them in some spots during the drop. I also have this white noise sweep that's taking us through the transition to the second half of the drop. Now, before we end this video, I want to make sure I talk about how I grab different elements from the drop and move them into the buildup to create tension. As you can see here, I have the filtered saw and the baseline top layer on the buildup, and on this base layer I have an endless smile and a low cut filter automating to wash out the bass as it nears the drop. One thing I really like to do for my bridges and my buildups is resample all of my tops files into one single audio file. That way I can add automations like endless smile to it and really wash it out towards the drop. I also have this 16th note snare drum that's automating with a low pass and high pass filter to really capture that tension. And then finally, to finish this buildup, I have a couple effect sweeps from our sample pack. So that is all the pieces of this project that I have to break down. Now that you have seen how all the individual parts work, let's go back and listen one more time to this drop. Alright guys, that's going to be it for today's tutorial. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you did. And if you would like to use the sounds from this project, make sure you check out our brand new Bass Tech House pack available on our website. The link is in the description below. If you have any questions about this video or suggestions for a future video, make sure you comment below as well. Follow us on all of our social medias for more producer tips and resources. I really appreciate you guys watching. Make sure you take breaks, stay rested, and I'll see you next time.